I do.
Good afternoon, Dr. Brown. Would you please state your name for the jury?
Sure. My name is Kimberly Brown.
Are you a clinical psychologist?
I am.
Explain to the jury what that is.
A clinical psychologist is someone who has a doctoral degree in psychology, who has specialty training and education in the diagnosis and treatment and assessment of both mental illness and psychological well-being. Clinical psychologists can do clinical work, can do research as well as teaching.
And where do you practice?
I work for Vanderbilt University.
And what is your title there?
I am assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm also a director of what's called the Forensic Evaluation Team, and I'm director of psychological services in the Department of Psychiatry.
And how long have you been at Vanderbilt?
I've been at Vanderbilt for 14 years.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about your prior background. Where'd you go to college?
I graduated from Duke University.
And what kind of degree did you obtain?
I obtained a bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in German.
And where did you obtain a PhD somewhere?
I did. So after I graduated from Duke University, I attended the University of Alabama, and it was there that I obtained my PhD in clinical psychology with a concentration in law.
Now, did you complete an internship as part of your degree?
I did. As part of completing your PhD in clinical psychology, after you've done your graduate school education, which is roughly 4 to 6 years, then you complete a clinical internship, which is 1 year before you get your PhD. And I did that at Napa State Hospital, which is in Napa, California.
Now, after your postdoctoral fellowship, well, first off, did you complete a postdoctoral fellowship?
Right. So after I completed the predoctoral internship and I obtained my PhD, then I completed what's called a postdoctoral psychology fellowship, and that was a year of specialty training after I received my PhD. I completed that through the University of Washington, and that was in the specialty area of forensic psychology.
All right. Now, explain to the jury what forensic psychology is.
Forensic psychology is the intersection of psychology and the law. So any psychological matters that also intersect with the legal system or have some involvement with the court system would fall under the specialty of forensic psychology.
Now, once you completed your fellowship, did you become licensed?
I did. I became licensed in 2002 in Tennessee.
And is that when you started working at Vanderbilt?
It is.
Kind of take us through, you briefly discussed your employment, your current title, but kind of take us through your employment with Vanderbilt.
Sure. So I have different responsibilities at Vanderbilt. I do my own clinical work, but a large part of my job is to also teach and train other people how to do this line of work. So I teach and train psychology trainees, the psychology interns. I teach and train psychiatry residents who have an MD and are specializing in psychiatry. I also sometimes give lectures to the Vanderbilt Law School. The clinical work that I do at Vanderbilt currently is primarily conducting what's called forensic evaluations. A large part of my job is a contract that I have, that Vanderbilt has with the Tennessee Department of Mental Health, where we conduct all the court-ordered criminal forensic evaluations in this county. So if there is a criminal defendant and there's some concern about their mental state, the court will sometimes order a forensic evaluation, and it's my team that completes those evaluations. A different type of forensic evaluation that I do through my work at Vanderbilt is I conduct what's called fitness for duty evaluations. These are evaluations to help determine whether someone psychologically is able to do their line of work. I also oversee the 28 or so psychologists in my department as Director of Psychological Services, so I oversee the clinical activity of those psychologists. And then I also am hired in various forensic cases, such as this one, to do evaluations.
Now, if I heard you correctly, a little bit earlier, you said you've been licensed in Tennessee since 2002. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And have you maintained your license since then, and is it current?
Yes, my license has been maintained and is in good standing.
Are you board certified?
I am board certified. I am board certified in the specialty area of forensic psychology. Board certification is a little bit different for psychologists than it is, for example, for physicians. It's elective. It's not required for psychologists to practice. Less than 5% of psychologists in the nation are board certified. So it is something that, again, is not required, but is something you can choose to do to advance your specialty area. And I obtained my board certification in forensic psychology.
Have you written publications in the field of forensic psychology?
I have.
Give us some examples.
A number of the publications I have are related to the fitness for duty evaluations that I talked to you about. And there's a team that I work with, and we've published papers related to our evaluations of that group. I've also published a couple of just general articles about forensic psychology. I also wrote a review of a book that was published, and the book was written on cognitive behavior therapy, and I provided a review of that, and that was published in a journal.
What about presentations in forensic psychology? Have you done those?
I have done those.
And can you give us some examples of that?
Sure. So both at, through the medical school at Vanderbilt, I've given presentations to both psychiatry and psychology trainees. I've given presentations to the law school at Vanderbilt. I've also given presentations to the psychology graduate program at Vanderbilt, as well as just Vanderbilt University classes. And I present on all types of issues. I present on issues like criminal responsibility and the insanity defense, something that's called malingering, faking a mental illness. I present on testifying in court. I present on competency to stand trial, for example, assessment of risk for violence. So there's a number of different topics that I've presented on.
Your Honor, if I may approach with the CV. Dr. Brown, is this a current copy of your curriculum vitae?
Yes.
Yeah. I'd like to introduce that as the next exhibit, Your Honor. And I have copies here for the jury. Can I pass those out? Dr. Brown, you've talked a little bit about what you do as a forensic psychologist. How many forensic psychological evaluations do you perform on average in a year?
On average, I would estimate that I do about 200 a year.
Do you have an estimate of how many across your career, approximate?
Yes. I would estimate that I've done roughly 3,000 across my career.
And have you testified in, well, I believe you did talk about testifying in court. So you have testified in court before, right?
I have, yes.
About how many times, approximately?
About 100 times.
Have you ever not been accepted as an expert in forensic psychology?
No, I've always been accepted.
Your Honor, at this time I move to introduce Dr. Brown as an expert in forensic psychology.
Okay.
And Dr. Brown, are all your opinions that you may give today given within a reasonable degree of psychological certainty?
Yes, they are.
Now let's talk about why you're here today. Were you retained by the hotel defendants to perform an evaluation on Ms. Andrews?
Yes, I was.
Now you're being paid for your services, correct?
Yes.
Do you charge for your service, or does Vanderbilt charge for your service?
Vanderbilt charges and bills and collects for my work.
So how is there an hourly charge?
Yes, we have a fee schedule. There's an hourly charge of $350 an hour.
And do you believe the amount that Vanderbilt charges of $350 per hour is reasonable within your industry?
I do. I think it's pretty standard for both my area of specialty and this region of the country.
Now, are your opinions that you give, are they affected in any way by who actually pays you?
No, and that's really important in my field, is to maintain objectivity and not be biased or led by who's hired you, to consider all the information objectively. That's very much emphasized in my field and in my ethics.
All right, let's get back to the evaluation of Ms. Andrews. When was that?
I evaluated Ms. Andrews on August 17th of 2015 in California, in Los Angeles.
And just, we're going to get in more detail about what all you did, but kind of give us an overview of what was the purpose of meeting with her in August 2015.
My job was to do an independent psychological evaluation of Ms. Andrews to determine what psychological symptoms and problems she may have and what those would be attributed to. And so when the purpose of my meeting with her was to conduct that psychological evaluation. It included both talking to her during a clinical interview as well as some psychological testing.
Now, in addition to this meeting with Ms. Andrews in August 2015, did you review other documents related to this issue?
Yes. As I'm sure the jury is well aware, there are quite a number of documents related to this case, and those documents, most of them I would have reviewed before I had met Ms. Andrews.
And are we talking like depositions?
Depositions, medical records from Ms. Andrews from the 2 psychological treatment providers she's had, social worker Lauren Comstock as well as psychiatrist Dr. Dupay. The depositions, I also looked at the complaint in the matter. I believe those were the primary documents I considered.
And the depositions, there were several depositions, right?
There were many depositions, yes.
Now, why do you review so much stuff like that in a forensic psychological evaluation?
A forensic evaluation is only as good as the information you have to do it with. So it's important to have as much information as you can get from different sources to get as full of a picture as you can about what the issues are. It's sort of like having a bunch of different puzzle pieces and looking at them and trying to figure out how they sort together and looking at the big picture. So you want to have as much information as you can to help inform your opinion.
Okay. So let's get back to the actual August 2015. About how long did you meet with Ms. Andrews?
About 3 hours.
So in general, just give the jury a little overview of what, I know you said about some testing, and we're going to get into testing, but in general, what all did y'all discuss?
Well, I met Ms. Andrews. I talked to her about the reason that I was there. I explained the nature and purpose of the evaluation, asked if she had any questions or concerns about that. Then we began talking a little bit about her life, whether she had any history of mental health symptoms or problems in the past, whether there was any family history of such, whether she had any history of any abuse or trauma or significant negative events like that in her life. Talked a little bit about her career, but most of my interview with her was focused on the video incident and the repercussions of that for her and the problems and symptoms she's experienced as a result of that. And then there were 3 psychological tests that were administered as well during those 3 hours.
Is it fair that in your interview with Ms. Andrews that y'all discussed the incident with Mr. Barrett at the Nashville Marriott Hotel?
Yes, we did discuss that.
Now, in your review of records that you obtained in this case, did you also learn about Mr. Barrett's actions as far as filming Ms. Andrews in Ohio?
Yes, at the Blackwell Hotel, yes.
Now, and also in your review of records, did you also learn about the Blackwell Hotel video being uploaded to the internet by Mr. Barrett?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned psychological testing. I want to talk a little bit about that. First, just tell the jury, give the jury an overview of what psychological testing. We're going to get into details, so just give them a little brief synopsis of what the psychological testing entailed.
Sure. So there's a wide variety of psychological tests that you could use for different purposes. Psychological tests are like what X-rays are to the medical field, is what psychological tests are to the psychology field. They're another way to obtain information in a standardized way about someone. So the way many of the tests work is they compare the way the person responds to the test with the way other groups of research-based populations respond to the test. So you have some standards of comparison. So it's additional information beyond just your own clinical opinions and experience. And the types of tests that I used in this particular case were basically personality tests. So there wasn't any concern in this case about brain impairment or intellectual functioning or things like that sometimes you can test people about. It was primarily related to symptoms and diagnoses and personality. So those were the types of tests generally that I administered.
And these tests that you administered to Ms. Andrews in August 2015, are those tests that you would normally do in a forensic psychological examination?
Yes, I would. I've done them many times before. They're also very consistent with the standards of the field. One of the tests that I administered is the most popular psychological test administered to people. So these are very common, well-used, well-validated tests in the field of psychology.
All right, let's kind of go through and tell the jury a little bit about these tests. I'm going to start with the Personality Assessment Inventory, or I guess PAI as it's known.
Yes.
What's the purpose? Well, first off, what is that test?
It's a general measure of psychological functioning. It tells you about how someone functions psychologically, what problems or psychological distress they may be experiencing. It doesn't make a diagnosis. Doesn't make a psychiatric diagnosis, but it can tell you about different psychiatric symptoms that a person may be experiencing. The other thing that this test and the other tests that I administered have is something called validity scales. And that is a way to determine both how consistent the person is responding to the test. For example, are they paying attention? Are they answering similar items consistently? Also provides information about whether someone may be either minimizing their problems or exaggerating their problems. So the validity scales provide an objective indicator of what's called the response style of the person answering the test.
So how do you administer these type of tests, specifically this one?
The PAI is a paper-pencil test. So I presented Ms. Andrews with a booklet. The booklet has a number of items, 300 and something, and she has to circle false, slightly true, mainly true, or very true for each item.
Now, what did the results of that test tell you, the PAI?
The results of the PAI were that overall, Ms. Andrews' psychological functioning is pretty good, that she's not experiencing significant psychological distress overall. However, the test did show that that she was likely having some symptoms and reactions to a traumatic event in her life. The PAI also suggested that compared to other individuals that Ms. Andrews is probably confident, goal-directed, driven, ambitious, hardworking, outspoken, self-reliant, that she'd like to be in positions where she could be in control and be directive in interactions with other people, and that's kind of consistent with her job. And there's a number of other things that the PAI looks at that were not significant in Ms. Andrews' profile. So, for example, there wasn't indications that she had significant anger problems or that she had significant depressive or manic, what's called manic symptoms. There wasn't any indication that she had psychotic symptoms. There wasn't any indication that she had problems with alcohol or drugs.
Are you discussing what you would consider normal?
Those would be normal scales, right? Those would be normal findings from the PAI. So in looking at the PAI, it was a generally normal profile of someone who seems to be functioning fairly well in life, but who does seem to be having some symptoms specific to a traumatic event.
Okay, let's go to the next test. It's the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which I like the abbreviation a whole lot better, MMPI.
Right, that's the MMPI. We use the second version now, it's the MMPI-2, and that's the test I referenced earlier. It was the most popularly used instrument in my field. Very common to use the MMPI.
And tell the jury what, in general, the purpose of that test.
It is, again, it's very similar in purpose to the PAI in that it's a general personality assessment instrument designed to assess someone's general functioning, general levels of distress and symptoms. Again, it doesn't make diagnoses, but it does indicate where they might be having trouble or not. It also has validity scales, just like the PAI.
How do you administer that test?
This particular test, the way I administered it to Ms. Andrews was on a computer. So it's 567 items. And this test is a true-false test. So the items pop up one at a time on the computer, and you indicate whether they're mostly true or mostly false for you. And you go through the 567, and then you're through. So that's the way I administered it to Ms. Andrews.
And what did the results from the MMPI tell you about Ms. Andrews?
I failed to mention that both the MMPI and PAI were reliable and valid. That indicates that Ms. Andrews was responding consistently, she was paying attention, and that there was not any indication that she was exaggerating problems. She seemed to be responding in a forthright manner to the test. What the MMPI showed was that it looked like Ms. Andrews was, compared to, again, other people who respond to this test, was experiencing some physical problems that are often rooted in stress. And the MMPI doesn't tell us exactly what those are. There was some indication of that. Overall, her profile, again, looked to be of someone who's functioning fairly well psychologically, who isn't having any major problems, who's looking pretty good from a psychological standpoint, but who has certain areas psychologically of problems. I mentioned the physical problems that could be rooted in stress. Her profile on the MMPI was similar to people who aren't very psychologically insightful to their problems. Sometimes it's difficult for them to know the nature and causes of their problems and describe them. They do have a tendency to kind of rely on other people for support and for help in dealing with their problems or fixing their problems for them. There was some indication that people who respond similarly may become somewhat irritable and resentful toward others who don't kind of support them. And there was some indication that she may have some mild feelings of people mistreating her or taking advantage of her, which is completely consistent with someone both in this legal situation going through a contested lawsuit as well as someone who's been through the incident that she's been through with the video and everything that followed it.
Any results from the MMPI that you consider normal?
Yes, most of the results were normal on the MMPI.
All right, let's move to the third test that you administered, which is the Trauma Symptom Inventory 2, the TSI-2. Tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what the purpose of that test is.
So this is different from the MMPI and PAI because this test is specific to people who have experienced traumatic events to assess what symptoms, if any, they may be having related to that traumatic experience. Again, it doesn't provide a diagnosis, but provides symptoms specific to people who have experienced trauma. And just like the MMPI and PAI, it has validity scales, and it has a number of other scales or areas that it assesses.
Now, how is that test administered to Ms. Andrews?
This is paper pencil, just like the PAI.
Okay. So what do the results or Ms. Andrews' results from the TSI-2 tell you?
Again, a generally normal profile, so most of those scales were not high or what we call elevated. They were within the normal range, except for a couple scales that indicate that she was having some problems in these particular areas that, while relatively mild, were still consistent with problems that someone might experience related to having gone through a trauma.
Now, once you reviewed your records, conducted your interview, administered your test, get those back, did you reach a diagnosis?
I did.
What was that?
I diagnosed Ms. Andrews with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's also known as PTSD.
Now, did you diagnose her with a mild, medium, severe? How does that work?
I would characterize her diagnosis as mild.
And explain that to the jury, please.
Well, mild comes from two sources. The first is that there are a range of traumas that can qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. So not any trauma or negative event can qualify for the diagnosis in the first place. And then you have to have certain symptoms. So the reason I consider it mild is because on the spectrum of traumatic experiences that people can go through, this experience is considered a relatively mild trauma, although causing distress and being a very negative event in her life on the spectrum of traumas that people can be experiencing, ranging from being a combat veteran and having experienced war and death and killing, having been kidnapped, having been a crime victim where you've been robbed and assaulted, having been physically abused for years as a child, having been involved in a serious motor vehicle or airplane accident. So along the range, spectrum of traumas, this would be considered on the mild side that would qualify for the diagnosis. And then secondly, while she experiences symptoms of PTSD, they are relatively mild in that they do not cause significant impairment in her functioning.
Now, we've heard about adjustment disorder previously. What is the difference, or is there any difference, between adjustment disorder and mild PTSD?
Okay, adjustment disorder came up in the deposition of Lauren Comstock, the social worker. We had a change in the book that we use to diagnose mental illness. The book that we use is called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, and it's abbreviated the DSM. And it is the accepted textbook in our field for psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, anyone who diagnoses mental illness to use. The version of that book changed from 4 to 5 in May 2013. When Ms. Andrews was being treated by Ms. Comstock, the book was in the 4th version. When I evaluated her, the book was in the 5th version. The reason this is significant is because what counted as an acceptable trauma for the diagnosis of PTSD changed from 4 to 5. So the video incident and everything surrounding it would not have met criteria for PTSD in version 4, because it would not be included, because at that time the definition of trauma was a actual or threatened death or serious injury or serious threat to the physical integrity of self. It would not have qualified under that. The definition slightly changed in DSM-5 to include acts of sexual violence. And for that reason, and that's further defined in the DSM, for that reason the trauma would fit under DSM-5. So saying all that, I will tell you that it's the same symptoms. It's kind of like if two people were looking at the same painting and they're identifying the exact same colors in the painting. That's red, that's blue, that's yellow. They're identifying the exact same objects in the painting. That's a line, that's a sunset, that's a person. But what they're calling the painting is slightly different. It's the same thing in this case. We're all seeing the same colors, the same lines, the same objects in the painting. But the name of the painting is slightly different just because of the change in our diagnostic manual.
Okay, now knowing her diagnosis, what does all this mean as to Miss Andrews being able to function psychologically?
The diagnosis itself doesn't tell you how someone functions psychologically. You have to look specifically at the degree of symptoms, and you have to look at how they're impacting someone's functioning in life. So what we do is we look at objective markers of psychological functioning. Consider things like ability to work and advance in your career, ability to have healthy, happy relationships, be close to other people, both in terms of friendships and intimate partners, your ability to engage socially in life, to involve yourself in life's activities. So those are some of the things that we look at to provide an objective assessment of someone's psychological functioning.
So if I understand you correctly, looking at how someone succeeds in their career is a marker that you're looking for.
That would be one marker. So the more severe the symptoms are, the more potential that someone's ability to function occupationally is going to be affected. Right? So if somebody is having pretty significant symptoms, they may have trouble getting out of bed in the morning to make it on time to work. They may repeatedly show up late to work. They may develop a substance use problem and drink during the working hours. They may be so irritable during working hours that they're constantly getting into conflict with customers or coworkers, and that's causing attention to the management staff. Or they may just be so depressed and withdrawn that they can't focus or carry out the daily activities of their jobs.
Now, based on what you said, well, let me ask you this. Have you reviewed documents and testimony regarding Miss Andrews' career from 2008 until close to the present?
Yes.
So we're going to talk about her career some, but I want you to tell the jury something first. Are you testifying that this video taken by Mr. Barrett and posted to the internet caused her career to skyrocket?
Absolutely not. Not at all. Not at all. She has attained this level of success in her career despite having been through this terrible event. She has done it. She has pulled herself together and has been very hardworking and driven and goal-oriented and just tenacious in wanting to achieve in a very difficult field. And she has done that despite the difficulties that this video has posed for her.
All right. At the time of this incident with Mr. Barrett, is it your understanding that Ms. Andrews worked for ESPN?
Yes.
Wrong one. There we go. ESPN. And after ESPN, did you understand that she moved, or changed networks?
To Fox?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I think I'm going to do it. How does this thing work?
Can you put it on dock cam?
Just have it on. Is it on?
Take a couple seconds to cut it.
Erin, can you hold for 1 second?
I think we covered this. This was I was asking you after ESPN, where did she go next? Which was?
Yes, she went to Fox.
And this do you know about when the move between ESPN and Fox was?
It was in 2012 that my understanding is she joined Fox.
Okay. Now, in addition to her employment obligations with either ESPN or Fox, are you aware about whether or not Ms. Andrews attends red carpet events and other type of promotional things?
Yes. Yes, from the information I reviewed, she does.
Is this one of the promotional for a movie?
Yes.
I can't get this thing to work. Are you aware that Ms. Andrews has also been on magazine covers?
Yes.
Since this incident since you learned of this incident in 2009?
Yes.
Now, we've heard stuff about Dancing with the Stars. Are you aware that she was a contestant on Dancing with the Stars?
Yes.
Is that a photograph of her and her dancing partner?
It appears to be, yes.
I got another one here. I think that they're practicing.
Okay.
And after Dancing with the Stars, are you aware if Miss Andrews became a co-host of Dancing with the Stars?
Yes, she did.
Have you also, well, let me ask you this. Has Miss Andrews substantially increased her ability to earn money since 2009?
Yes.
And how do you know that?
I've reviewed her tax returns.
And again, what's the purpose of that? What does all that tell you that we just went through?
It's just one marker of growth in her career.
And how does that relate to your psychological diagnosis?
I don't know that it relates to the diagnosis per se, because the diagnosis is based on symptoms. It does relate to the issue of overall life functioning, of psychological functioning, if you use work and career as one marker of that.
Okay, and let's talk about another marker. You talked about social support or family support. Did you also look at that as far as turn this thing off. Did you also look at her family life?
Yes, and this was consistent in the documentation I reviewed, in what she's reported to me, as well as in the psychological testing, which does have some measures of social support. She has incredible social support. She comes from a very loving, invested family. She has a close relationship with a boyfriend. She has a network of friends, so she has very strong, good social support. Some of her relationships there's indication that even gotten closer as a result of this traumatic event.
Now, you talked about a long-term relationship. I want to talk about also, has there been stress related to her long-term relationship? I'm assuming you're referencing to her boyfriend.
Yes, Jared Stoll.
Yes.
Yes.
So what have you learned about some of the stress that's been involved in that?
And this would be from the records that I reviewed, including the medical records from Dr. Dupay, the psychiatrist, as well as the deposition by Mr. Stoll. That at times Ms. Andrews has been worried about him because he's had some physical injuries, required surgery. That was a bit stressful for her. There was some indication in her treatment records regarding stress about his family. There was also, from Mr. Stoll's deposition, some indication that there was some stress in the relationship and worry on her part caused by his arrest.
You talked about treatment. You've mentioned that you reviewed some treatment that Ms. Andrews previously sought after this incident. When did Ms. Andrews first seek treatment after learning about this incident in July 2009?
In March 2012 with Ms. Comstock.
And give us the range of time that she saw Ms. Comstock from March of 2012.
It was until April of 2013, so just a little over 1 year.
And about how many sessions did she have with Ms. Comstock?
It was about 30 sessions.
Now, is there any indication, in your opinion, as to the delay in seeking treatment? Let me ask it this way. I've kind of butchered this question. What does the delay in seeking treatment from July 2009 till March 2012, what does that tell you?
That she wasn't experiencing enough impairment in her functioning or symptoms serious enough to be motivated to go into treatment at that time. That her treatment in March 2012 was motivated in part by Mr. Barrett being released from prison, and that causing her some increased anxiety and distress.
Now, did Ms. Comstock, did she recommend a certain frequency of visits?
Ms. Comstock in her records comments that visits were not as regular or consistent as she recommended, that she recommended that Ms. Andrews attend treatment sessions more regularly, more consistently.
And is that an issue in psychological health about attending sessions regularly?
Yes, absolutely.
Would her symptoms, well, we'll cover this in just a moment. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you said that you had reviewed records from Ms. Comstock and Dr. DuPay, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, did you, after April 2013, when Ms. Andrews stopped seeing Ms. Comstock, when did she start seeking treatment again from Dr. DuPay?
It was about a year later, in June 2014.
And how many sessions, and how long of a period of time did she see Dr. DuPay?
The last treatment session that I have documented is May 2015.
So a little over a year.
Yes, a little over 1 year.
Or right at a year, I guess I should say.
Right.
How many sessions did she see Dr. DuPay in that about a year period of time?
9.
And do you know the frequency, how those 9 were scattered about?
I can look that up in my report. They were scattered, so sometimes more frequently, and then there would be spaces in between visits where she wouldn't see her at all, and she would come back again. But it was 9 overall.
Were there several months gaps in a period of time?
Of no visits? Yes.
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 Now, is the treatment that Ms. Andrews received from Dr. DuPay, is that sufficient?
It's not sufficient for almost any condition, but certainly not sufficient to treat what I've diagnosed her with PTSD. So psychotherapy depends on regular attendance and follow-through, typically week to week. So it's a weekly attendance, and that's to maintain treatment gains and to continue to work on material from the week before. So attending consistently is very important, attending regularly, having weekly visits, as well as having a focus to the visits that's directed specifically at treating that particular condition. So psychotherapy has advanced to the point where it's not a one-category-fit-all. There are specific types of therapy that we know now from research and investigation that are better for certain conditions than others.
Based on all the information that you have gathered as it relates to Ms. Andrews, what is her psychological level of functioning?
Well, based on all the information I received, including the records I reviewed and the psychological testing and my interview with her, she is a resilient, stable person who functions fairly well psychologically despite the horrible experiences she's been through.
Do people that are significantly impaired typically thrive at work?
No, that would be one marker of significant impairment. They wouldn't thrive in work, potentially. They would have significant problems in their relationships, difficulty getting along with others, difficulty being close to others, forming relationships, withdrawing socially, not going out, not connecting to other people. That would be another marker.
Do people that are significantly impaired thrive at relationships?
Not typically, no.
Do people that are significantly impaired have the ability to go out and have fun and participate in a lot of social activities?
I mean, it depends. If you're significantly psychologically impaired, one or more of those markers you're going to see problems in, whether it's intimate relationships, employment, substance use, social activities, or all of those, depending on the level of impairment. If you're able to do those things despite your distress, it indicates a level of functioning that is higher than the people who can't do those things, who just are unable to complete those tasks because they're suffering somewhere where their level of functioning is lower.
Do you believe that this emotional distress that you've discussed about, as far as it relates to Ms. Andrews, is severe or permanent?
I don't. I think it's significant. I do not think it is severe, as I've testified to earlier, nor do I think it's permanent. And the reason I say that is because we have very well-researched, validated treatments that work for PTSD, for this specific problem. It's called cognitive behavior therapy, abbreviated CBT. It's the treatment of choice, for example, that the VAs use for combat veterans coming back who have fought in combat and who have developed PTSD symptoms. And it has become actually a manualized, standardized treatment that we use to treat this condition that, under the right circumstances with the appropriate therapist, using the appropriate techniques that are specific to this treatment, can be done sometimes within 12 sessions. 12 sessions is actually the standard for using this type of treatment for this population, and with very good outcomes.
So, if I understand you correctly, if Ms. Andrews received CBT-type treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy-type treatment, what do you expect her result to be?
I would expect significant improvement, if not resolution of symptoms, because that's what we know about this type of therapy, and that's what we know about the effectiveness of it, particularly because she has a number of promising signs for the prospect of treatment being effective. She doesn't have any previous mental health symptoms, so there's nothing kind of confusing or convoluting things with other diagnoses. She doesn't have any previous traumas or history of abuse. So people who have what we call serial traumas or serial abuses, they've been abused as a child, they've been abused in adulthood, then they have another serious trauma happen, those individuals are more difficult to treat. The third variable is that she has very good social support, and we know that people who have strong social support are more likely to get better with treatment. Social support is an important part of people recovering psychologically from problems. And she doesn't use any or abuse any substances, so we don't have that complicating the treatment picture as well. So I would expect a good prognosis, a good outcome from appropriate treatment delivered at the appropriate frequency for this type of condition.
And I think you said this, but I want to make sure I understand. When you were talking about frequency, what are you talking about as far as CBT sessions? What are we talking about here? How many?
It's typically once a week. It's typically 12 sessions or 3 to 6 months to expand it a little further, so that would be somewhere between 12 and 24 sessions.
And what do these sessions entail, just in general?
Yeah, so CBT treatment is not just going in to see a therapist and sitting on the couch and talking for 50 minutes and the therapist kind of nodding their head and not judging you and then you leave. That's not what CBT is. CBT is a specific technique where the C part, the cognitive part, is where you get people to re-examine their thoughts. So, and this this can be used not just for PTSD, it can be used as a very common treatment for depression as well. But we know that sometimes the way we think about things doesn't help us. It can actually make our psychological problems worse. It's nobody's fault, that's just the way our brains work. Sometimes our thinking is faulty. And so cognitive behavior therapy gets people to examine their thoughts and alter them when necessary if they're not serving them very well. So for example, people with PTSD often have very negative thoughts about themselves or other people or the world, such as, I'm always going to be damaged. The world is a dangerous place. I'm never going to be safe. So you get people to examine and test these thoughts, and you get them to alter their way of thinking as part of that theory of therapy. The B part is behavior. So PTSD is basically a prolonged stress experience where the body and the mind are stuck. They're stuck in this reacting to trauma mode, and it's not able to move past. It's a state of psychological stuckness. And so one of the things that CBT does is it gets people to confront the really scary things for them, such as the video, and not experience that level of arousal and anxiety anymore when encountered by it. So this is very scary for people to do, but it's very effective to encounter those scary experiences and get people to reduce their level of anxiety and arousal in the face of those experiences so that it doesn't hijack them anymore when it happens in the future.
And you previously stated 12 to 24 sessions is what you would recommend. Is that right?
Right.
Of CBT therapy. Tell the jury, what does that cost?
Well, it depends on what area of the country you live in. Would you like me to clarify that?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about Miss Andrews' area, Los Angeles.
Well, Los Angeles is more than Nashville in terms of fee-for-service. So the best estimate that I have for you is that in the Los Angeles area, a typical session of cognitive behavior therapy with a doctoral level provider, psychologist, would be about $200 for the session. So a course of 12 sessions would be about $2,400. If you expanded that to the 6-month time frame, that would be about $4,800.
And once Ms. Andrews completed your recommended treatment, the CBT therapy that you've been discussing, do you believe her symptoms would be completely gone or greatly diminished?
Right, I do, yeah.
Now, let's get back a little bit to your opinions. Were there multiple causes that contributed to Ms. Andrews' mental health issues that you've been talking about?
Yes, based on my analysis and examination of the case, there do seem to be several factors operating here that were contributory.
And we've all heard about Mr. Barrett, and the jury's seen his testimony. And we've heard discussions about the time period where Mr. Barrett's identity was unknown, and there was no apprehension of him. Was that a factor?
Yes, I think that was a very distressful period of time for her because she didn't know who he was, where he was, if he was a continued threat to her. Sure.
What about learning about Mr. Barrett stalking her to several cities and conducting the personal information search? Was that a factor?
Yes, I think that was very upsetting to her to know that he had been able to locate her at several locations, had been able to access her information, and had videoed her twice, two locations.
What about, we've heard about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but have you investigated about or seen information about death threats that were made concerning her to the Dan Patrick Show?
Yes.
So go ahead.
These were threats that she became aware of, as far as I can tell, in about April of 2010. And my understanding is that the threats were email threats to the Dan Patrick Show, and they had started back in the fall of 2009. And they were initially sexual in nature toward Miss Andrews, and then they became violent, in which they threatened to murder her. And it was at that time that, based on my review of the articles and information about it, the FBI became involved. There was an investigation done. The person was located. So there was this time when she was receiving emailed sexual and death threats to the... She wasn't personally receiving them, but they were being sent to the Dan Patrick Show, and then she became aware of them.
What about death threats from Twitter?
Yes, there is indication that in October 2012, she received some death threats through Twitter feed from an individual who, again, was located.
What about, and I think you kind of touched on this, Mr. Barrett being released from prison?
Yes. Yes, this was at some point in early in 2012, and was what we understand is the impetus for her seeking treatment for the first time with Ms. Comstock, that she was very upset that he had been released and she had not been informed of it, didn't have any forewarning of his release.
Now, continuing on with your assessment, even without the recommended treatment that you've just discussed, the CBT therapy, is Ms. Andrews experiencing any significant impairment in her daily functioning?
Not that I can tell, no. That she's not experiencing impairment in those significant impairment in those markers that we discussed, although she is experiencing some distress.
And how can you make that finding?
Basically, based on the evidence that I reported, she has some symptoms. She is managing them fairly well. She's a very resilient individual who has a good background and good coping skills, and she has kind of triumphed over these and is not failing in any areas of her life. She's doing very well and succeeding and having good relationships and thriving in her career, and has attained her dream job since this event. So those markers are not significantly impaired in her life.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.